Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Dennis DJ Dodonna to the Notre Dame Newman Center and University Church. Currently, DJ serves as senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Harvard School of Business, from which he graduated with an MA in 2010. Leaving Harvard, DJ co-founded the Entrepreneurial Finance Lab, a fintech for-profit social enterprise. In a 2013 New York Times article on the venture, DJ states that he was recruited from HBS to be the greedy capitalist. That's a joke. As Chief Operating Officer and Chief Sales Officer, he was responsible to sell banks on this new approach for measuring loan risk among poor people in undercapitalized areas. Using psychometric testing, they sought to measure the traits at the core of entrepreneurship: fluid intelligence, business skill, integrity, and attitudes among the potential loan recipients to predict an applicant's future behavior, specifically whether he or she will be able to and will pay back a loan. In time, the EFL's work won the confidence of risk-averse bankers in places where credit bottlenecks severely stunted growth. EFL was among the winners of a G20 Challenge for Small Business Financing in 2011 and had enabled over $2 billion in capital to underbanked businesses and individuals across 20-plus countries before it was acquired in 2018. All of that is important for our topic tonight because after 7 years of traveling the world and hustling this new concept in banking, DJ burned out and had to make a significant change. Taking a sabbatical changed the direction of his entire life. During that year, among other things, DJ spent time in Japan, walking 900 miles on a pilgrimage, so he says, and ran the Wilson Sheehan Poverty Lab, known as LEO, back at Notre Dame, his alma mater, where he and I met when he had arrived as a first-year student. LEO helps service providers apply scientific evaluation methods to better understand and share effective poverty interventions. DJ also became determined to change the way the world thinks about time off, and teamed up with social science researchers to look at and evaluate the role that extended leave has played in our society. Our teaser for tonight's talk states, what they found may surprise you. And that's what we're here to learn about. Friends, it's my pleasure to welcome an innovator, an entrepreneur, international businessman, teacher, concerned citizen of the world. It's also a pleasure to welcome an old friend to this city and to this place where faith and reason intersect daily in how we think, pray, and act. Friends, DJ Dodonna.
Thanks so much, Father Gary. If you know Father Gary, and I'm assuming that you all do, feel free to laugh in the church, and so I'm hoping that we can laugh and have a relaxed chat today about sabbaticals. The first joke that Father Gary introduced was, never tell a joke to a reporter, or else your joke will be in the New York Times forever. And it doesn't seem like a joke. So I'm going to be holding my phone because I'm using it as a remote. So if things go awry, just know that's why we're running behind the stage. I want to talk to y'all about sabbaticals. And first, just want to figure out, kind of test the room. How many people here consider that they've taken a sabbatical? Ooh, all right. How many people want to take a sabbatical? Okay, and the rest are just heckling me, I'm assuming. I can move around? Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to do this work, and because we're here in this beautiful church, I'm going to bring it back to the root cause and definition of sabbaticals, which is rest, right? So sabbatical, Shabbat. You don't have to read this. I know it's small. I'll read it to you. From Genesis, on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Also, if you're familiar with the concept of Shemitah, so resting every 7 years, letting the fields lie fallow. From Leviticus, when you come to the land I'm giving you, the land must be given a rest period, a Sabbath to God. For 6 years you may plant your fields, prune your vineyards, and harvest your crops, but the 7th year is a Sabbath of Sabbaths for the land. It's God's Sabbath, during which you may not plant your fields, not prune your vineyards. Do not harvest your crops that grow on their own, and do not gather the grapes on your unpruned vines, since it is the year of rest for the land. So one of the interesting things about sabbaticals is there's this rich tradition of faith that kind of runs through it. So in the States, the first weekend was actually because a mill in New England was giving Sundays off for Christians, and the Jews among them wanted Saturdays off, understandably. And the Christians were kind of upset that the Jews were working on Sunday to make up for Saturday, and that was how the weekend was formed. And so we have like this rich tradition of using faith and using the Bible to as an excuse for rest, but otherwise I don't think we would give it to ourselves. So when we set out to do a definition of sabbatical, I think when most people think of sabbaticals, they think of academics, across the street or across the way, what we call the, I'm from the Trinity College of the United States, Harvard Business School, and we think about like a tenured professor taking time off. So typically you get a break every 6 or 7 years, but on that break you actually don't get to drop all of your responsibilities. You have to still do research, so it's not really a break. But this concept of sabbaticals for non-academics, is anyone here an academic? Okay, so everyone's non-academic. I'm also a non-academic. That's why they call me a senior lecturer and not a professor. And so we wanted to create a definition that made sense for folks who were not academics. And our definition includes 3 components. So 1, extended time. So what does that mean? Like, what is the minimum that you can do to take a sabbatical? We don't know. But what we learned from the research is that it takes at least 6 to 8 weeks in order for people to like feel unplugged, take off that mask of work and actually start to feel like themselves again. So I would offer at least 2 months is enough time, ideally 3 to 6, but extended time, intentionally off from routine work. So important about intentional, it doesn't mean that you chose to take time off. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but 2/3 of sabbaticals actually happen to you, right? So they're catalyzed by some profoundly negative event. You have no choice over whether or not to take it. But once you're off, so let's say that your company goes broke or you get fired, your routine job is to find another job, right? Like your routine job throughout your life is to work. And so if you take that time and kind of make it sacred, make a fence around it, then you can consider yourself being on sabbatical. Otherwise, you're just on an extended job search. And then off from routine work. And the reason we talk about routine work is it's not like you can't do things that seem or feel like a job when you're on sabbatical, but the further away you can get from your routine job, the more benefits you'll get from it. So we'll see time and time again folks who say, they leave some like banking job and they say, like, well, I'm going to do a little bit of consulting, like an hour a week here or there to extend my runway, or I'm going to help someone start up a fintech company, and that's just going to make it very difficult to actually enjoy time off. So things that are kind of like jobs that people will do, get yoga teacher certified, scuba training, maybe help a friend or a family member start a business that's completely different. Write a book is a common one. But you want it to be like pretty far away from what you do for your routine job. But I think more importantly is why. Like, why should we take a sabbatical? And here's another very small printed phrase. So from Abraham Heschel from The Sabbath, he talks about how Judaism teaches us to be attached to the holiness in time, attached to the sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. The Sabbaths are our great cathedrals, and our Holy of Holies is a shrine that neither the Romans nor the Germans were able to burn. It's not the observance of the Day of Atonement, but the day itself, the essence of the day. And so Heschel talks about how the Sabbath is a cathedral in time. Instead of building monuments, you make space and actually architect time off, time for yourself, time for God, time for the folks you care about, which I really like. And in the more kind of like secular version of that, Annie Dillard, who I love, who's a great author who wrote The Pilgrim of Tinker Creek, in her book, The Writing Life, she says, how we spend our days is of course how we spend our lives. What we do at this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule defends from chaos and whim. It's a net for catching days. So just to pause on this, how we spend our days is of course how we spend our lives. We get caught up in kind of like the day-to-day, and then you look back and realize that like you didn't really make a lot of choices as to what you wanted to do. To continue. A schedule. It's a scaffolding on which a worker can stand and labor with both hands at sections of time. A schedule is a mock-up of reason and order, willed, faked, and so brought into being. It is a peace and a haven set into the wreck of time. It is a lifeboat on which you find yourself decades later still living. I think that's important, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the rest of the presentation. Is your schedule something that kind of like allows you to get something done? Is it something that saves you? And or is it something that you end up kind of stranded on and you spend your entire life on this lifeboat as opposed to charting your own path? That's at least how I read it. So a couple of the things that we learned when we did the research, and I'll talk about the antecedent to it, but essentially I spent a couple years chatting to people from all over the world, all different ages, to figure out why they took their sabbatical, what happened on their sabbatical, what happened when they came back. And a couple things were surprising, at least to me. I wasn't an academic. I had had this sabbatical experience, which I'll talk about. But the interesting thing was having this personal experience, wanting to know if other people shared that experience, who got to take time off, and then being able to connect it with the academic literature around what happens in people's lives and identity and growth and all that fun stuff. I'd never studied any of it. So one of the things that we found, and one of the reasons for a sabbatical, is the super majority of people, when I was kind of warming them up to talk about their sabbaticals, they would mention how the way they worked and what they did had these deep, deep origins in their family and friends. So in the research, they call it family of origin. And it was either you orient yourself towards or away from what your parents did growing up, or you orient yourself towards or away from how your parents worked growing up. And so it's not necessarily, this is an interesting thing, I think, it's not necessarily what you choose to do for work. Like I, as Father Gary, read my bio, which I need to condense, I now realize. You can do something that is very positive, it can be your dream job, it can be doing good in the world, but it's the way that you work. It's not necessarily working in banking and you burn out from that, and working in nonprofit you don't burn out because it's so meaningful. It's the way you work that actually gets you to where you are. And so we found that people make these decisions very early on with how their family works, what their family does for a living. They make these decisions about what to study, what internships to get based on what the peers around them are doing and how they're acting. And then you kind of like stop and you look back and you say, wait a minute, I don't know if I actually made any of those decisions myself. I don't know if I was the driver here. That's the typical kind of pathway that we see folks go on. The second is, as we've all, I think, a silver lining of the pandemic, we've seen how burnt out everybody is. In 2019, before the pandemic, the World Health Organization talked about burnout as a global pandemic, right? So folks not engaged at work, wanting to leave, wanting to quit, not having enough energy to do the things that they said they wanted to do. What we found in our research is what we termed functional workaholism. People don't know that they're burnt out. They don't know how burnt out they are. They don't know what the consequences of the way they work and how burnt out they are until they step away from it. So in these sabbaticals that are catalyzed by negative events, even if you sold your company or you had, like, your company has a sabbatical policy, it's not until you step back and you spend maybe 6 to 8 weeks away that you realize that the way you were working is separate from who you are. Most people kind of assume it's a condition of living and working. So people had like trigger fingers that wouldn't alleviate. They had like GI issues and ulcers, and no matter how many doctors they'd go to say, like, this is a stress issue, you need to not work as hard. Their attitudes were more like, I've like worked my way through it in the past, like it's fine. And they don't see that it's actually separate from themselves as people. So my take on why sabbaticals is, as I said on the slide at the beginning, is regret insurance. Like, you want to live a life that you don't regret. You don't want to look back and regret your life. And we have a lot of evidence and research on what people typically regret in their lives. I call on three normally. One is a palliative care nurse from Australia, Bronnie Ware. Has anyone heard of Bronnie Ware? So she wrote this book. She spent I think 25 years as a palliative care nurse working with folks on their deathbeds. And she wrote a blog post about the 5 most common regrets of the dying that went totally viral, and then it became a best-selling book. So I'm going to read those to you right now. Number 1, I'd wish I had let myself be happier. Number 2, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. Number 3, I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Number 4, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And number 5, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. So that was the number 1 regret that everybody said, right? So I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. So kind of sound familiar to that functional workaholism and family of origin? So everyone has paper and pencil, hopefully. What I want you to do is just spend a minute or two. If you were on your deathbed tomorrow, what regrets would you have what regrets would you have in general? But if you need more specificity, how you work, how you spend your time, what you choose to do differently. I notice no one's finished early. Everyone's got a lot to write. So now what I want to ask you to do, and I always hate it when people ask me to do this, but I'm going to ask you to do it, is find someone in your pew or row or nearby, and if you're willing, I want you to kind of spend 30 seconds talking about a couple of yours to the other person, switch. Okay. Is anyone, would anyone be so courageous as to share? How do you call this place to order, Father Gary? With like a bell or something? Okay, would anyone like to share? Just like a couple volunteers to share. All right. Okay, can we come back real quick? I love how everyone's excited to talk to new people. Okay. What was yours? All right, we have a spend more time with friends. Anyone else willing to share? Yeah. Do you have one you'd like to share? Yeah. Do you know why? Why you were unable to see it?
I haven't analysed that, but that could be something like, oh, she never really liked me, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Perhaps. But it has struck me that that could have worked out, for example, and so that.
Cool.
There we are.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. One more?
Between the actual work itself and time off social life and spiritual life. Because certainly a personal state, spiritual life was pushed to one side.
Yep.
And it's only now regretted.
Right. Yeah, so back to these themes, I guess, here. Failure to achieve a balance between personal life and work, prioritizing the spiritual, which is exactly, why I did my pilgrimage on my sabbatical. I felt like there's always these urgent things, but the important things are hard to kind of prioritize time towards. I spoke to someone who was a chief technology officer of this fancy company, and I was asking similar questions, and he said, I would love to do a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And he's like, but, especially in America, we get like 2 weeks, 3 weeks of vacation. So I'm not going to spend 50 to 75% of my vacation by myself. There's no way I would be able to justify that to my wife. And so he'd never done it. And so it was, it's quite sad. If you can't even say, I want to spend 10 days meditating, doing whatever, that's kind of the ether of the work culture that's pervaded across the world. Okay, so what Harvard thinks about regret. So we talked about Bronnie Ware. Here's what some Harvard researchers think about regret. So first there's Clay Christensen. If you've heard the term disruption, like business, like to disrupt in a business context, which is way overused now, you can thank Clay Christensen. Clay Christensen, the year that I graduated from business school, found out that he had terminal illness. And so we asked him to speak to the class around his learnings and how he would apply his learnings from business into living a good life. And so he gave this talk that eventually turned into a book called How Will You Measure Your Life, which I would recommend reading. And one thing he talked about is like folks don't create a strategy, right? So similar to that lifeboat that you're just living in, folks don't actually be intentional about what they want to do and how to get there. And you end up kind of maybe in a position like yourself where you're like, man, I got the balance wrong. And oftentimes it's not about being intentional about making a strategy. And the second that he talked about is what he terms the marginal cost mistake. So Christensen was a devout Mormon, and he had this funny story that he told. I'm not sure if it's funny, but he was also very tall and was a really good basketball player. And so he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he was at Oxford. And partially because of him, they were in like the championships. I don't know what you would call them here or whatnot. They made it all the way to the finals, and the finals were on Sunday. And he's like, sorry team, can't play. Made a commitment. Sunday is dedicated to God. And everyone was like, this is the finals, you have to come. And he's like, can't do it. And they lost. And similarly, he made a commitment to his family on Saturdays. And so when he was a young consultant, it's Friday night, late, they're wrapping up, and his boss was like, all right, see you guys tomorrow bright and early. And he's like, actually, I don't work on Saturdays. Saturdays is my day for my family. And, the guy's flustered, like, what do you mean you don't work on Saturdays? And he's like, listen, I promise I'll do good work, but I don't work on Saturdays. And he's like, all right, Clay, but, I better see you here early on Sunday. And he's like, well, now might be a good time to mention that I also don't work on Sundays. Sundays are for God. And so, what Clay saw over and over again is that people will say, like, these are my values, but then they'll budge on them a little bit, and then it makes it even harder the next time. Like, well, are you going to budge this time, or you're not going to budge? Is it important enough? And so he talked about having a strategy and not making the mistake of not adhering to it, because then each time you have to make a decision, and there's marginal cost to doing so. And the last thing Clay talked about is beware of incentives. So he would see folks at the reunions for Harvard Business School 5, 10, 15 years, and what he noticed is that some of the folks who were the most successful in business were no longer showing up. And when he would reach out to those folks, typically he would hear the same thing over and over again, which is, like, I don't want to go, I'm embarrassed, like I'm on my XYZ number of wives, or my children won't talk to me, and everyone wants to talk about family stuff, and I feel ashamed. And what Clay chalked this up to was, it's very easy to see if you're doing a good job in business. You have like 360 feedback, you have monthly review sessions, quarterly, annual, you get raises, you get performance improvement plans, you get fired, you get promoted. It's very difficult to see if you're doing a good job at home with the family. So marginal costs, you miss one football game, soccer game, you miss one, whatever. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but over time, you attend to those incentives at work that are rewarding you and punishing you, as opposed to the ones with family. And then you can't kind of go back and heal those wounds from not being attuned to your family. So really being careful about like these incentives, about how you think about life. And then also there was the longest study on kind of like human development. It's called the Grant Study. It started at Harvard in 1942. A lot of famous people, including John F. Kennedy, were in the study. It was only among men and basically white men at that time, but they also did a study that they, in Boston. It was a more diverse study, so these results kind of held upon across both pools. But so they would get together and they would do all sorts of tests, blood tests, physical tests, emotional tests, interviews, deep interviews with folks, and figure out like what was correlated with people that were happy, with people that were successful. Was it health? Was it genes? Was it marriage? Was it success and job? And you'll see an article published about every 5 years in the Atlantic or so, but there's just one thing that led people to see if they were going to be happy and successful and healthy, and that's relationships. Friendships, family, prioritizing things like relationships, which again, back to Clay, is difficult to do because the incentives aren't so clear. But it's the one thing that predicts kind of happiness and success. So I tell you these two lenses just because I think that sabbaticals, obviously, can serve as a way to figure out what your priorities are, give you time to actually practice them, and give you the space to do some of them. So as Father Gary read, this was me before my sabbatical. I had all of the, I think, things that people would say are coordinated with success, and so the company was going really well. We had Harvard Business School cases written about us. I had bad quotes in the New York Times and all this stuff. And it was my dream company. We were doing good in the world, helping get loans and access to finance to folks that needed it in emerging markets. We had an amazing company culture. as like an American from the Midwest, I was getting to travel all over the world and visit all these cool, interesting places. But I was just absolutely depressed after like 7 years. Like I could not get out of bed. I had even worse facial hair than I have now. People were like, hey, listen, I think you should like shave. And it was really confusing because I feel like the narrative that I had always known is if you work in a job that you hate or has really long hours, you'll burn out. But as long as you pursue your passion, then that's like the thing you should do, right? So what do you do when your passion is no longer satisfying you? And it really threw me into like a bit of an existential crisis of like, if this isn't making me happy, what will? So I did the only thing that I knew how to do, which was I took time off. So I talked to my co-founder. He was feeling similarly. We created a sabbatical policy in our company to give ourselves some time. We spent a year and a half hiring people that could sub in for us and kind of replace us. And then I spent 4 months on sabbatical. I walked a 6-week pilgrimage in Japan, where you visit 88 temples all around the island. The reason I did that was because I walked the last part of the Camino de Santiago, which was fantastic. It's a great kind of recipe for self-analysis and healing. And there's actually an article in the New York Times today about a famous actor that went on the Camino with his son, which is a pretty interesting read. He just wrote a memoir about it. But that's like the marquee event, right? That's like the thing you hear in a bio. What was really important to me was my mom was really sick, and I was traveling all over the place, and I was not able to be present for her. So I actually got to spend a couple months cooking meals for her, helping my dad around the house. I wrote my first song and I performed it in like a open mic in New Zealand. I helped my cousins move. I built a deck and like learned how to remodel a kitchen. Like all these things that, are just kind of, were interesting to me, things I wanted to do, but there was never time for it, never like enough time to enjoy it or try it. I spent a lot of time outdoors. And I volunteered at this poverty research nonprofit that Father Gary mentioned, the Lab for Economic Opportunities. I was able to say to them, hey, listen, I've decided to take some time off. Is there anything I can do to help, as opposed to just being this person that comes in for board meetings or it gives time in little chunks? And they said, yeah, actually, why don't you come and run it? And so I left my company and I halfway moved to Notre Dame and ran this nonprofit long enough to figure out that I needed to find someone else to run it who was better than me. So I hired an employee who was amazing and has done amazing stuff. So all of these things, there's no way I could have done it with my regular life. And this period of 4 months of travel and kind of like a year total where I was doing a non-routine job is the densest set of memories of my entire life. If you think back to any part of your life, you're like, what'd you do during 4 months, 7 years ago? Probably pretty similar to what you were doing in and around. Maybe we might remember 3 years ago a little bit more poignantly, but everything kind of blends together. So I just created this really dense set of memories from my life. And I came out saying, I don't want to be the sabbatical guy necessarily, but I think something really important happened here. It's not just a long vacation where I feel refreshed and ready to go get it. It was like a reorientation of my identity. So I set about trying to see if we could find evidence and proof around this, because I thought it was so important that it should help other people justify it. I mean, everyone knows that a vacation is nice, but if there's something really important around the extended period of time, you got to bring some research and evidence towards it. And so when I think about how to talk about the results, I'll talk about it first in quotes, because I think they're qualitatively describe what happens. My sabbatical was the best decision I've ever made for my relationship with my partner. I realized that up until our time off together, I never knew my daughter as a person. I can't imagine living the rest of my life without knowing what I learned on my time off. I realized my entire self-worth was based on external validation. I now see success as the amount of joy something brings me. I felt that I had to write this book to keep on living. So this is some of the nature of the experiences and the impact that people had on their sabbatical. And basically what we found is that there's 3 stages. One, you take time and space to explore, to be yourself again. In doing so, you get this perspective and you realize how far off track you'd gotten. And then 3, you're able to make changes and dive back into like routine life in a way that's more authentic. So it's kind of these 3 stages of practice. Think like an internship. You're practicing a new way of being. You're taking time to recover, hopefully, up front, to heal. And then you're exploring what's out there. So in this sense, I think of business school as the world's most socially acceptable sabbatical. Like, you take 2 years off, you pay a bunch of money, you travel around, you observe what other jobs are out there, what other people, cultures, you learn a little bit, hopefully. And when you get finished, people pat you on the back and say, congratulations. But if you try to do that yourself, write yourself a $200,000 check and self-direct, people are going to ask, like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? And so we do have these pockets in our society and in our culture that are like socially acceptable sabbaticals. And so one of the goals of this research and my book is to try to like pull those out and talk about them so that people have permission. So there's typically 3 kind of ways that people engage in a sabbatical. I call them sabbatical archetypes. One is what I call the seeker. And so a seeker, like that quote, I can't imagine living the rest of my life without knowing what I learned on my time off. A seeker has burning questions, curiosities, things about yourself you've wanted to explore for a while. They may be spiritual or religious in nature, or about getting to know another part of yourself outside of what's propelled you to success in school and working life. The second is explorer. You can't believe you're as old as you are and haven't seen the blank. Your travel resume doesn't match up with how you see yourself, or your professional resume for that matter. So think of the person that said, I realized that up until our time together, I never knew my daughter as a person. This person actually, they spent their sabbatical traveling in an RV to all the national parks in the US. And then the achiever. So the person that said, I felt I had to write this book to keep on living. So you have something deep inside yourself that needs to be born in the world. Is it a book? Is it getting yoga certified or completing that hiking circuit, mastering a foreign language? All you need is some space and time away from routine life to do it. The other quote that I think speaks to the achiever is, I realized my entire self-worth was based on external validation. I now see success as the amount of joy something brings me. So you take someone who's set on like achievement and accomplishment, you pull them out of that for a little bit, and they're actually able to define success in a different way. So another 2 minutes, and then you'll have to help me kind of call it off and get back to the discussion. But I'd love for you guys to write, what would you do with 3 months completely off? And if you want to talk about which archetype fits your goals the most, so how would you spend your time? How would you hope to feel upon returning from sabbatical? And I'll go back to the archetypes so you can see them. So how would you spend 3 months off? All right, we're going to keep going, and maybe we'll do another share out at the end just so I can make sure that we get some time for Q&A. So, just a few surprising findings from the research. One, I alluded to it earlier. Over 2/3 of sabbaticals are catalyzed by a negative event. So you think that you're going to plan to travel or to do the things you want to do, but at the end of the day, you wait until it's too late and something happens. Either a health crisis, a health scare of yourself or someone else. You get fired, your company goes bankrupt, potentially a global pandemic, who knows? And so, like, if you wait to take a sabbatical will take you. I'm sure of that. We talked about family of origin and other inspirations of how people work. The fact that folks are in this kind of functional workaholism mindset. So to the outside looking in, they're successful, they're doing a good job, they're probably getting good reviews at work, but it's not until you step away that you realize that you were just treading water, and we're not living and working in the way that you wanted to. Most people, especially those who are thrust into a sabbatical, return with a lot more kind of security around taking risks. Mostly because they just did something that society and culture says is very risky, like quit your job or be outside of work for 6 to 12 months. And they realize that it's totally fine. They can most likely get a job, even a better job. They come back more healthy, more able to work in a sustainable way, and it frees them up to take more risks. So the path of travel that we see folks from a career perspective is you go from working for someone else to either breaking off and doing that same thing but working for yourself. So freeing yourself up to allot your time how you would like, spend time with loved ones, spend time however you want, or actually kind of spinning off and starting something completely different. That's like the typical path that we see folks do. Or, and this is for the business owners in the crowd, folks say, like, you know what, I got a chance to go explore what it would be like to not work at my job, and I kind of like my job, and I kind of like the people I work with. I just need to create healthier boundaries and to heal a little bit and have some time away from myself. Also, people tend to return with a more pro-social mindset. So that's like academic ease for caring about people outside of themselves more. So, the subtitle of the talk, using sabbaticals to save the world, we have people that started, like Impossible Foods was a sabbatical taker. We have a friend of mine who started an electric airplane company because he's really thinking about the climate and spending time in nature. That's possible, that's pro-social. But even more common, people are saying, you know what, I would just want to spend more time with my loved ones that I wasn't doing before, right? And so whatever your circle of others is, people return with a more kind of externally facing circle. I'll skip this, but I think it's just important to note that over 1/3 of Harvard Business School students 10 years out, graduates 10 years out, have taken a sabbatical. The reason I bring this up is because folks are scared of what it's going to look like to take time off. And over 1/3 of folks actually have taken this, even though you would assume that it's much lower. And this is how people rate their time off. So the supermajority of folks are saying it's one of the best times of my entire life. And even more people than that are saying they're extremely likely to recommend it to others. And the difference there is, sometimes like a sabbatical is not always fun, right? You're getting thrust into it when you don't want to. It can be very difficult. You're having like a dark night of the soul. So just because it's not always fun doesn't mean you wouldn't recommend it to someone else. And then this chart's kind of difficult to read, but people are 5 times more likely to fear how folks will perceive them on sabbatical than they are to actually perceive people negatively. And so they're worried about what other people will think. What will they think of me if I take time off? But actually people don't judge them for that. And they really want proof that what they're doing is safe and okay to do, which is one of the reasons why we created this research. Okay, so if you're taking a sabbatical, here are my suggestions. 1, make sure it's long enough, right? There's so many stories where people take and companies are well-meaning, but if you have a sabbatical policy that's measured in weeks and not months, you're probably going to get to the end of it and be like, oh man, I was just getting to the good stuff. So if you can, take 3 to 6 months off. If you can just take 1 month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, that's great. I think you'll get to the end of it saying, I was just starting to get to the good stuff. But if you can and design yourself 3 to 6 months off, that's best. Make sure you get disconnection, both geographic, if only for a little while, so you can break that routine, and then also electronically, right? So it's so hard. Are you setting, is your company completely cutting off your communication? Have they totally found folks to take up your work so that you're not kind of like still plugged in? Make sure that you take time to heal. So especially those achievers who are like, I just want to take time off so I can write a book or so I can do this other thing, accomplish this other thing. Don't forget to take care of yourself. One way I think to do this, and I see this all the time, is that folks will say, all right, I'm taking time off, and then I'm going to like learn this foreign language, and I'm going to learn how to cook, and I'm going to like do this, and I'm going to do that. So you're kind of subbing out like accomplishment, intellectual accomplishment in one zone for another. Do stuff that embodies you, right? Like yoga, dance, pottery, like things that kind of get you out of your head and more into your body. Do something, at least part of that's other focused, so it's not just about your kind of like vacation. I think that will be rewarding. And make sure to explore. So if you're one of those people that has to have everything scheduled, I see some people giving sideways glances to their partners. Experiment with what it's like to not have a plan for a little bit, right? And I think what you'll find is that things turn out fine, and that can potentially free you up to take more risks when you come back. We talked about this a little bit. Don't do your routine work, even if it feels like, I'll just do like a couple hours a week of consulting with former clients. That couple hours will prevent you from doing all sorts of things you want to do. It'll take up way more time than you think it will. Trust me. You got to get out of that routine, because it's just really hard if you're trying to like be on sabbatical from 8 to 5 and then existing in everyone else's container. So to the extent that you can get out, if at least for a period of time, do that. Try not to jobify fun. And so folks will be like, okay, I'm going to do scuba certification, and then I'm going to do 1, and then level 2, and then level 3, and then I'm going to turn into this. Just try to do stuff that's fun, not that looks impressive, which is way more difficult for some folks than others. And then I wanted to just mention the fact that sabbaticals are a privilege. And there's significant barriers to entry. Here are the 3 main barriers to entry that we've seen. Cost, like how can I afford to do this, is the most obvious one. Optics, what will people think if I take time off? Responsibilities, how can I have a mortgage to pay, I've got a partner, I've got kids, there's no way that I can jet off and walk around some temples in Japan for 6 weeks. Everyone's sabbatical is different. The reason that I started the sabbatical project is to give optics cover to people so that they feel permission to take time off. We've seen that countries, cultures, companies that offer sabbatical policies enable people of all shapes and sizes and abilities to take time off. And so we have to value it, right? At least in the States, we're just now starting to get to the point where we're valuing parental leave even. A thing that, we were all babies, right? Whether or not we're choosing to have babies. And so if you can be at a position of power in your company to show people that it's okay to take time off, to enable people to be able to take time off, that's the goal here. And responsibilities, it's obviously way more difficult to take time off if you have kids, but I've seen some of the most impressive and awesome stories from people that took time off with their kids. So exchanging education at the school for education via travel. The quote that you heard earlier about like not getting to know his daughter as a person until he took time off. Too often we're kind of flooded with all the responsibilities and the errands that revolves around parenthood as opposed to like actually spending time present with your kids. So difficult, but worth it. Okay, last exercise. And then I'd love to kind of open up for some questions. Actually, let's do a few questions now, and then we'll end with the written exercise. So does anyone have questions about the research?
We'll use the microphone because it helps upstairs. There are people watching us online, so it helps.
My question would relate to the feasibility of sabbaticals. I think what you've given us really is geared towards American set of circumstances and so on. It certainly wouldn't apply to the developing world, and maybe middle income countries, question marks, in short, what I'm saying is that I don't think it's feasible in an awful lot of work situations. People are, it's a very risky type of thing. While you're away, your job might be done by somebody who's away better than you, So you won't be welcome back, yeah? So my question in short is that it's a very limited type of experiments,
Yeah.
Uniquely geared towards academics.
Yeah. So what we found is that, listen, that is true. And I think that it's about how we prioritize as a society, right? There's some countries that have, for example, Australia has long service leave. And so it's 6 months for every civil servant across the pay grade, right? Why is that the case? 6 months after 5 years, after 7 years, is because it took a long time to sail from the UK to Australia for the civil servants. And after they stopped having to sail, people were like, I'm not giving that up, right? In the same way that we have parental leave, like more and more countries are offering people parental leave, paid parental leave with benefits. The US is way behind. It's a thing that we've decided as a society is important, and then we build around it. Like no one at a company, it's not convenient for anyone to have someone leave to go on maternity leave or paternity leave. But it happens, and so the people at the company kind of pick up extra weight in order to enable that thing to happen inside the company. I would argue that sabbaticals can be, in that sense, more equitable, because anyone can take a sabbatical. Not anyone can or chooses to have kids, right? And obviously, parental leave is not fun and games. You're not getting to necessarily choose what you want to do. And so the point of this is showing that there are benefits to companies to actually doing it. It's not just sacrifices. So to your point, I think, which is viewing it from like a more of a scarcity mindset. It's like, what happens if I leave? They'll see that they can replace me easily. The flip side of that is, and we just heard this last week, someone left and they said, like, I'm quitting. And the company said, actually, how about we'll leave you with your health insurance. Just don't quit. Just consider coming back. They spent a year away, and they came back and they said, I have a list of impossible demands. They're this, I don't want to do this, I want a different team, I want to do this and this. And the company said, great, let's do that. And so it actually can empower the employee to put down some of the stuff they don't want to do, pick up some of the stuff that they do want to do. It requires more of a medium-term kind of value creation mindset from companies, which is quite at odds with where we are with capitalism right now. But I think what we've shown in some of the experiments is it can actually, people come back more creative. They can come back with more allegiance to the company because the company gave them that time off, as opposed to companies that let people all the way to burn out before they let them go. So I think there's a lot of building evidence around that this can be better for companies, individuals, and society. But right now, it's the early bleeding edge, just like it was before they had weekends, right? My understanding is that the idea of the 40-hour work week actually came from British munitions factory during World War II, where they wanted to see how far they could push folks, how many hours they could push folks to work, and that's where they dialed it back to 40 around that time. And so, the concept of the weekend's only been around 100 years, and we're experimenting, as you saw with remote work, with flexible work during the pandemic. So I think it's an era of experimentation, and I want to bring evidence to some of the claims and questions.
Yeah. I'll make a quick point maybe in response to the last comments. I think I work as kind of I describe myself rather vaguely as a management consultant, but I'd be happy to say that I'm pretty sure I could replace absolutely anybody with either a system or a process or another person or an office in another country or something like that. So I think it's not that scarce a process. Very few things are, even if they're very responsible, I think very few things are kind of irreplaceable. And that's kind of the culture I work in as well myself. Longest I think I've spent in any job in my adult life has probably been about 3 years, or even in any one country in my adult life has been about that amount of time. So the environments are the markets, the industries, the companies I work in are just too volatile. There's no, for most of them, there's been no kind of payoff from a long-term relationship. And that has worked kind of quite well for me. But there are people like, I'm guessing you're not a teacher, you know, and that's say, you know, the Irish primary and secondary school teachers. They, many of them basically go on careers breaks. And I think our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, who was in office until about, 2016 or so, he in theory was still working as still a teacher on a career break, even though he'd been in Parliament nearly 40 years. So all his employment contract and his pension and everything were still there for him as a teacher. I think the current Deputy Prime Minister is in the same situation. So I think it is very good. That does happen. It's as common in middle-income countries, you know, in kind of emerging Asia, Indonesia, Turkey, places like that, as it could be anywhere else. So I'm. Can I? No, just a quick comment. Yeah, no, I'm kind of on a sabbatical myself at the moment. I've been off work for about 6 months. Partly basically, I'm doing a degree in kind of computational statistics, which I've wanted to do for 6 or 7 years quite strongly. So I just kind of fell into doing that when I returned back to Dublin. And I have a social project as well. Basically, I've taken upon myself to start a war, which I'll talk to Father Gary and other people about at some point soon.
Not a fan of war.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, maybe one more question, and then we can talk some more. I'm willing to stay as long as y'all want to.
Sorry, I took a sabbatical based on an Irish company, and it's 33 years working with them. Decided I was going to take a sabbatical. Thought I might get 12 weeks, 14 weeks, ended up being 6. But I took it at the exact wrong time. Massive management change coming in, and people were saying to me, "Are you mad going at this stage?" I said, "What's the worst you can do to me? Sack me, pay me to go, whatever it is." And we went on it. It was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic. But I came back, I wouldn't say a different person, but certainly a much happier person, and very much more confident in my work. And nothing has gone wrong in work since I came back. It haven't. It's never gone against me. In fact, I'd say in many ways, people saw the value in me when I wasn't there, and other people had to make decisions that they didn't enjoy making. So for a lot of things, it was fantastic. But even getting away with her was fantastic as well. Mind you, everything was organised.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, okay, so maybe one last question. Thank you for sharing.
Hi there. Thanks for your talk. I just have a question. In your research, have you seen sort of how different age groups of people approach this differently in order to afford it? And sort of, so I was just wondering if those teaching English abroad, voluntourism type trips where you get your board and lodging at an orphanage but you working at the orphanage, things like that, is more what younger single people do, and the different categories of people sort of approach the affordability and length and all of that differently. Yep. I'd just be interested to hear, because I'd love to do something like this myself, but I would not be able to sustain myself if I didn't have a salary each month. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's funny because no matter what age someone is, they always look back and they say, well, I could have done it then. Like, I couldn't possibly do it now, but it was so much easier back then. And so even though it seems impossible, like, one thing I would say is that very few people can take a sabbatical now, right? But if you can plan ahead a few years and actually put some savings into place, like, it becomes more possible. And so if it's part of our cultural narrative around, like, oh, you're allowed to take time off at this time, you're allowed to take time off at this time, then we might have had like more savings and that sort of thing. So what I would encourage is absolutely, like, beg, borrow, and steal. Do anything you can to be able to take time off. So if it requires woofing, working on an organic farm for a little bit, great. If it requires teaching English in a foreign country, great. I think those are excellent, like, gateway drugs to be able to take more time off, and I think you'll learn a lot. So not everyone has the privilege to do some blowout around the world trip. I think I spent like $800 over the course of 6 weeks on that walking pilgrimage. So, like, there are things you can do that are quite cheap, not like the fanciest or most glamorous. But I would encourage you to try to, like, set some date, 3 years in advance or something. Make it a goal. look for fellowships, look for like things that can enable you to do it. But yeah, you'll benefit from it. Like it's a good segue to what I wanted to talk about last, which is, I think the premise of my book is basically trying to create these inflection points, identify inflection points across people's lives that it's okay to take time off and beneficial to take time off. And I thought, taking advantage of the fact that we're in a church here, so thinking about sabbaticals as sacraments, right? So we have like initiation sacraments, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist. We have healing sacraments, penance and reconciliation, anointing the sick. We have sacraments of service, matrimony, holy orders. Like, where are our sacraments in more secular life, right? What I would suggest is thinking about 3 categories of sacraments. Sacraments is the wrong word, but work, like taking time to celebrate and signify some of our work milestones. So gap years, like early on in folks' career, I wish I would have taken it, so I'd have had the courage to not study engineering, which my dad wanted me to study. So Father Gary got to hear from me a lot my freshman year when I was flunking out of engineering. A gap year is about self-authorship. What if we normalize that and it was part of your growing up process to determine who you want it to be for that segment, as opposed to using family of orientation and what your friends and colleagues are doing. Grad school or an apprenticeship. So again, I think about the MBA as the most socially acceptable sabbatical. It's about like opening up the aperture to what else is possible for you, right? You might open it up by going abroad, by doing some different work. Do you like teaching? Things like that. Or it's about like tightening in the aperture, doing an apprenticeship to be able to train to do something else, right? Doing like a grad degree to say like, all right, I want to learn this other thing so I can go in this direction. Pre-retirement. So I'm involved with this organization called the Modern Elder Academy in the States. Chip Conley wrote a book about the wisdom of modern elders. Basically, like, can you take time before you retire to zoom out and say like, okay, in the last chapter of work, do I want to maximize money? Do I want to maximize learnings? Do I want to actually steer what I'm doing towards another direction? I think that should be a thing that everyone does. The second category is around relationships. So imagine if we actually took time and it was okay to do celebratory sabbaticals, right? Where, let's say you get engaged, or I've heard of people take what they call like a monster moon, like a huge honeymoon, to celebrate the fact that you're going to be spending the rest of your life with this person. Honoring spending time with your kids. So in the New York Times article today, talking about like what a gift it is to be able to walk the Camino with your child, right? We had someone in the study took a Land Rover to Central and South America and basically like homeschooled their kids over the course of the year. Parts of it totally miserable, right? No babysitters, your kids are on top of each other the whole time, but it created closeness within the family and memories that like could not have been created in living a routine life. Empty nest. So what happens when your kids leave the nest? Why is there no sacrament around that? Why is there no kind of inflection point where you say like, okay, now I get to shift off from, hopefully, being responsible for these kids and shift back to reinvesting in the relationship or rediscovering myself and who I want to be in this next chapter. And so these are all things that you can kind of schedule. Like the work ones, you kind of know like when they're going to hit in your life. The relationship ones, you don't know exactly when they're going to hit, but relatively you do. So like you know when you're going to get married and you can plan that around, or you know when your kids are a certain age that you want to take time off. These emotion ones, they can pop up whenever. But if we knew that if there was permission around taking time off, then I'd imagine we could use them actually intentionally. So grieving. So many of the sabbatical stories were about being jarred out of life by the passing of a spouse or an own personal crisis, taking care of an ailing loved one like I did. Why don't we make space for that in our society to actually say like, I want to be present for 3 months with this thing that's really tough but important to me. Seeking, so going on the kind of spiritual search, right? Like we don't kind of marrying the secular and the sacred. We should, offer folks permission to take time to seek on the spiritual side, on the personal side. Healing. You're burnt out, you have a trigger finger, you have stomach issues from work. Like in the States, I don't know what it's like here. I'm sure it's there's more kind of like government coverage, but in the States you have to take this like disability leave if you can't drag yourself to work, right? And you kind of pay in on each paycheck. Like we should not use this as like pulling a parachute at the last minute. This should be like a dental regularly scheduled checkup. And so these are the kind of like, what I would offer is a way we can think about the structure of taking time off in the future. So as I was saying, a sabbatical is about privilege. To your question, which I totally agree. I mean, this is something that only folks that potentially work in management consulting can afford to do, right? And I think like consulting firms actually are some of the worst at work-life balance, but also some of the best because they offer things like breaks in between the projects. Like if they're structured right, they can do it. So it provides an interesting perspective in the States. But like make sure that others can take this time off, and that's by doing it yourself and showing people that it's actually possible, giving them permission. Setting up enabling policies at the companies and organizations that you work for so this can be like a more equitable thing, and moving towards a society that's kind of more humane. So that's the talk on sabbaticals. Happy to answer some more questions. Happy to share.
I actually thought you meant by don't forget to work to make others can too.
Yeah.
You have to work twice as hard if you let someone come.
Maybe they can hold the bucket for you, and then you can take time off, and then you can hold it for them. And yeah, yeah, exactly. So thanks for coming. I mean, feel free.
What I thought we could do now is simply thank DJ for his talk, but we'll also have an opportunity for tea and biscuits in the back, and I'm offering him for a few more questions. So, but thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.